Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's Rebecca Levis coming to you from San Diego, California, and we are studying the Torah together. Today, we're in the book of Deuteronomy, and we only have a couple more portions left, and then we're done with this whole cycle. We're in the season between the beginning of Rosh Hashanah and the feast of Yom Kippur. This is a very somber time for all Jewish people because they have 10 days to make things right between their fellow man and God. And it's a time to really look at their heart and do a little MRI of their attitude, things they need to correct, ask forgiveness for, that kind of a thing. And then they hope that their name is inscribed in the book of life for another year on Yom Kippur. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, about having our conscience and our minds cleansed today in this part of scripture. So I think it's very appropriate that we study this chapter in Deuteronomy. I'm going to be starting my Hooked on Hebrew class September 21st. It's going to be on Tuesdays on Zoom Live. It'll be from 9:30 to 11, and it's a 6-week class. If you're interested in participating, you can email me at rjlevis, Levas, @gmail.com, and I'll send you the link so that you can sign up for the class. And it's basically the Hebrew alphabet. You're going to be learning the basics and a lot of information and great resources for studying the Word of God and how to look up all your Hebrew verses in the Blue Letter Bible. And that is a great resource as well. So let's get started. I'll put on my glasses so that I can see things through the eyes of our Hebrew brothers and sisters. So let's get started, and I'll share my screen. Okay, let's say the prayer that's said traditionally before Torah study. And it goes like this in the blue. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu bemitzvotav, v'tzevanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us. That just means sets you apart for his special purposes. He sets us apart with his commandments, his words, and then he commands us to meditate on those, to have them in our head all day long. Why? Because it's his word that gives us life. It's his word that gives us purpose, and it helps us walk out God's plan for our life. So today we're in Deuteronomy 31, and there's only 30 verses. So this is going to be a short teaching today. And it's probably a good thing today because I have a little bit of a cold, and I'm going to try not to cough through this. So let's get started. So this is Moses, one of his last conversations with the new generation of the children of Israel. And it is his last important words before he dies. He's been told by God that he's going to die. And now it's this portion of scripture begins with God speaking to him and saying, this is what I want you to do as your last assignment. So you can see the faithfulness of Moses throughout this whole Torah. I have come to really love and appreciate Moses in a way I never have before after going through this cycle of the Torah. Okay, so he's basically completed his mission, but he has a few more last minute things to do prior to his death. So it says that Moses went, he was obedient, and then he spoke to Israel. So let's look at those two words. To go is to go or to walk. It's the word halach in Hebrew, and it means to progress forward step by step. So Moses is now taking the steps necessary to convey the message of God to the people. And isn't that what our role is as servants of God? We are to go and then to speak, not necessarily to the Israelites, although that is a priority, but also to speak faithfully the truth of God. And then it says speak. So he went and he spoke. Look at the word for speak or spoke. It's the word debar. And it means to speak, And the verb, it means to gather separate parts. It also means the innermost. So where everything is gathered. So remember, he's speaking to the children of Israel. This is a group of people God has gathered together to be his very own. Then he's gathered them to a specific land where he's going to provide for them and bless them. And then it's also the name for the place where they're to gather to have their sins atoned for. And that is the Holy of Holies. Did you know that in Hebrew, the term for Holy of Holies is the word, and it's just in a different form, devir, right here, devir. And actually, this should be a V. I'm going to change that. Okay, so the word for to speak and the word for innermost, because that's where it comes from. Our words come from our innermost thoughts. It's the same place of the Holy of Holies where God makes atonement for his people, the innermost place. And what's the innermost place in us? Isn't it our heart? And so God comes to transform our hearts, to circumcise the flesh of our hearts so that we can know him personally. And that is exactly where we're going to be going today when we're speaking about the Day of Atonement and God's word. Now, Moses says here, I am 120 years old today. Now, why did he tell him that? 120, very significant, is back in Genesis 6:3, when God saw the condition of the people right before he decided to end everything in the flood. He said, my spirit will not live in human beings forever, for they too are flesh. Their lifespan I'm going to limit to 120 years. So there were 12 tribes and there were 10 commandments. And if you multiply 12 times 10, that is 120. So the number 120 in the rabbis' minds always speaks of Israel, God's people. So here's Moses saying, I've completed my course. I've done the 120-year span. And now I have a few last-minute details to share with the people of Israel. So God said this just before the flood and the death of all living people except the remnant of Noah and his family. So out of every judgment, God saves a remnant. And we saw that after the flood, and we're going to see it at the end of days as well. So on that day that he spoke to them, it was like he was saying, this is the day of my death, but it's also going to be the day of my birth, because I'm transitioning from this kingdom to God's kingdom. See, it's all about kingdom. They want to bring kingdom down, where we as Gentiles think about, we want to take heaven and go there someday. But in Hebrew thinking, they want heaven to come down and heal earth. And so Moses is about to now leave this kingdom to go to God's kingdom. He's done his work. He's been faithful. He brought them where he was supposed to bring them. And now he's going to speak these last words to him. So his life purpose has been fulfilled, hasn't it? Talk about one's destiny written in stone. This was Moses' destiny, to bring the word of God written in stone and then have it written eventually on our hearts. Isn't that what it says in Jeremiah? It says, I will make a new covenant and I will write it on their hearts with Judah and Israel, the two kingdoms, and I'll bring them together. Well, this is a beautiful picture of the nation of Israel. So this was his destiny fulfilled. Now, he then says, I can't get around any longer. Now, this is a terrible translation of that. When you look at it in the original Hebrew, it makes him just sound like he's old and feeble and he's about to give up because he's too old to do anything. But there's more to what he's saying here. If you look at it in the original Hebrew, it means I can no more go out and come in. Now, why did he use those two words, go out and come in? This is a well-known phrase spoken by great kings and military leaders. If they could no longer go out in battle and in victory and come in with victory, then they would assume that their life purpose is over. So Moses is saying, I can no longer go out and come in victory with you, but he's going to send somebody else to lead them in, and it would be his right-hand man, Joshua. We know all about Joshua, don't we, from past study. Back in Numbers, we read about Moses taking Joshua and changing his name from Hoshea to Joshua, meaning Yahweh saves. And so it's going to be him that leads them into the promised land. Now, moreover, Adonai has said to me, you will not cross the Jordan River. Adonai, your God, will cross before you, and he will destroy those nations ahead of you, and you will dispossess them. In other words, they'll be gone. Joshua, he will cross over ahead of you. Adonai will do to them what he did to Sihon, Og, and the kings of Amorih. Now, these were the strong nations that he defeated just prior to this. So look at how many times you see this word crossover, crossover, crossover. The word crossover is avar, and avar means to make pregnant as well, because a man takes his sperm and crosses it over into a new soil. Isn't that interesting? That the word for to cross over means to give life, to make pregnant, the passing of seed. You see, this is a spiritual picture as well of God saying, I'm taking the promised people and I'm going to put them in a new place where they're going to thrive and have new life. That's a beautiful picture. This is a beautiful word. And it was a leaving of one place and a crossing over to a new promised place where there'd be new life and new growth. This is a picture of our spiritual regeneration, where God takes our old life and we cross over through baptism, through the water, and we become a new creation in Christ. This is a beautiful picture of crossing over water in order to have something new happen. And we see this way back when Abraham did the same thing, when he was called by God and he had to cross over the Euphrates and go to a place where God was taking him. He didn't know, but he was obedient, and he began his faith walk. So anytime you see these rivers that people are crossing, water in a river represents, by the way, inheritance. The word nahal for a river means to inherit something, because a river comes down from the mountain and it brings with it life and it waters everything below it. And so the earth below inherits the rain from the heavens. So it's the word for an inheritance. So it's no coincidence that they're crossing a river in order to receive their new inheritance. And this is about what Moses is about to do, right? You know, people say, oh, I'm going to cross over into the kingdom. I'm crossing Jordan to the everlasting hope. That's a picture of what Moses is about to do here. Now, Joshua would be then his successor. And I said his Hebrew name is Yehoshua or Joshua, and it's the same name for Yeshua or Jesus. It comes from the verb yesha, which means to save. And look, it also means to grant essence of existence, as if it's related, salvation is related to giving a new birth. Isn't that beautiful? So new birth means I'm saving you from this place, which meant death, and bringing you to a new place, which means life. And so Adonai said later to Joshua, get up and cross over the Jordan, and I'll give you every place you step on the sole of your foot. Don't be afraid or downhearted. I'll be with you wherever you go. And what a beautiful promise for God then to speak directly to Joshua, just like he had to his spiritual father, Moses. So it was showing Joshua that he was with him in that same intimacy that he was with Moses. And he's encouraging him. Oh my goodness, there's people in our lives right now who are going through such trial that need encouragement. And if we have the living God living in us through his spirit, then part of our job description as servants is to minister and encourage other people with that same kind of intimacy and new life by sharing the good news of Jesus with others. That's our job as servants. That's our purpose and plan. So God gave him these words: be strong and be courageous. And I love this word courageous. It's the word emetz. Now it sounds very similar to emet. Emet is the word for truth. So see, it shares the same first two letters, aleph, mem, but it ends in a t and a t. So they're sound-alike words. So to be courageous is the word for truth. So when we're sharing with somebody else, we're stepping out into perhaps enemy territory or unknown territory. And God's saying to us, don't hold back, be courageous, speak the truth, and share the love of Jesus with other people. So I love how these two words are cognate sound-alikes because they're related. It takes courage in sometimes in situations that are awkward or that are intimidating or where we might be misunderstood or mocked. It takes courage to stand up and speak up for the truth, doesn't it? I wanted to show you those words. So sometimes just changing one letter can make a huge difference in a word in Hebrew. I wanted to show you an example of that. He said to not be afraid. I wanted to show you the word afraid. It's the word don't fear, and it's the word yara. Now look, there are three different words that all sound like yara in Hebrew. Yara, yara, yara. But notice they all end with a different letter. Aleph, this one ends with a hey, this one with an ayin. But they're going to be related in some way because they share two of the same letters. So let's see if we can figure out how they're related. Okay, don't be afraid or don't fear. Fear is something we bring to constant attention. So if we're always thinking about something negative that might happen, then we're going to hold back in fear because it's constantly on our mind. But if Jesus is constantly on our mind, then we're not going to hold back. We're not going to be restricted in any way. So see what this third word is, yara, to be restricted or limited. So we're only limited or restricted when what is in our constant attention. Now, if Jesus can do for my life what he did for me, then what is in my eyes every time I speak to somebody is, hey, if he can change me, he can change them, he can change you. And I know that joy of being transformed and having new purpose and new provision and new promises in my life. And then look, it's also related to another word, yara, which means to cast forth rain. That's where we get the word for Torah, to cast forth from heaven. So our words, when we speak and share them, they're cast forth into somebody else's life. Look how beautiful all these words are related to one another. I had to show you that before we moved on. One last quick thing. This last word, to restrict space, let me show you how beautiful that's used in Hebrew. See that word, yod, resh, ayin? I'm going to go back. Yod, resh, ayin. Let's go here. It means to limit space. It's the sheet of the parchment on an animal's flesh where you stained it with the writing of God's word. Wow. Isn't that what Jesus did when he became flesh and he became limited in who he was? He left his place in heaven and came to this restrictive place, this planet, to have the word of God etched on flesh. Wow. That's the name of this sheet. And it's one sheet out of 50 to 65 that you'll have in a Torah scroll that's all rolled up in one. I think that's beautiful. So Moses tells Joshua that God will go before all the people and help Israel, and that also God will do to the other nations what he did to the other enemies. Now he's speaking about physical enemies, but he's also saying basically that I'm going to defeat all your enemies. And that is a message for you and I today, because when we give our life to Jesus and we begin to trust him and walk in his truth, then he has conquered in us our own sin, because he's given us a power that we didn't have prior to our trusting in him. That power is a deposit until we meet him face to face. It's a guarantee or a seal or a sign of something that's coming. And so that seal and sign is new life and given power to overcome our sinful nature. And then ultimately, because he rose from the dead, we too will rise with that same power that raised Jesus from the dead. So those two enemies, sin and death, were conquered by God at the cross. So God told Moses to write down the words of the Torah. Write it all down. And it said he wrote and wrote and wrote until he was finished. And then he was to take it to the Kohanim, the Levites, the priests. And they were instructed to read all of it every 7th year. And it was the year of the Shemitah, or the year of rest, where people would be released from anything that held them captive or anything that they regretted losing. And it was in that time of rest that he wanted them to hear God's love words again to them. So they were to read the whole thing. Imagine every 7th year, the whole nation standing and listening to the reading of the entire Torah. That must have taken all day, maybe days, I don't know. But the Torah was to be for all people standing there today. That meant men, women, young people, babies, foreigners among them. They were all to be there as one, hearing the word, the Torah. Now, this is such a picture of the Messiah coming and standing in front of the people of Israel as the living word, as the Torah himself came and stood before them and began to speak the words of the Torah. He began to walk out and flesh out all the prophecies of the Torah. He would be the one that would heal the blind, open their eyes, raise the dead, cast out demons. These were things that only the Messiah was prophesied to do, and Jesus did them all. Yet the Pharisees were blind, and they wanted control over the people. They were religious, but they didn't have eyes to see, nor the power to understand. So they created dividing walls between men and women, and men and women and children. And today, when you go to Israel, you go to the Western Wall, the prayer wall, there's a division here. Here's women and children, and here are the men. And in many Orthodox synagogues today, they're still separated, the men and the women. The women sometimes will be up in the balcony, or there'll be a dividing wall. But this shouldn't be. This should not be. We are one in Messiah and one family. And Jesus came to remove all dividing walls, division between people, between families, between people of faith, and unite them under one banner, and that's the banner of love. And so things one day will be made right. So what were they released from in this year of the Shemitah, where they would hear the reading of the Torah? Well, all personal debt, and that meant physical debt, but also debts emotionally, regret, shame, guilt, injustices that I've done to others or others have done to me. So who are you in debt to? Who haven't you forgiven so that you carry around that burden of unforgiveness? Or what shame are you carrying unnecessarily? when the Bible clearly says that if you're in Messiah, there is now no condemnation. He's removed all guilt and shame, and he's brought justice by paying for our sin debt. And so we might have regret and remorse, but this is the time of year when we repent of that before God and we come into his presence and we let him scan us and say, Lord, take these things from me. Let me walk in freedom and let me walk in truth. So God established 3 times through 3 of the major feasts where the men would come along with their families up to Jerusalem, and they're called the foot feasts or the regalim in Hebrew. And the men would go up to Jerusalem to appear before God. And that way it's like they're coming to bring the best that they have to God through their sacrifices, and then rededicate themselves to God, and then ask for forgiveness. So this was 3 times a year on Passover or Pesach, Pentecost or Shavuot, and Feast of Tabernacle or Sukkot. So these are the 3 foot feasts. Now it literally reads, appear before his face. Isn't that, come before his presence? That word for presence is panim, or face. So his presence or his face is tied with the word Shekinah, or we've heard Shekinah, because it's the radiance of his glory that you're bringing everything in front of. Because remember when Moses came down from the mountain, his face was radiant with the glory of God. So that glory is the Shekinah or Shekinah of his brilliant light. And then that's exactly what we see with Jesus when he was transformed on the mountain. Remember, that was the glory, the Shekinah of God that shone all around him. This reminds us coming before his presence of the shepherd, the good shepherd, in the parable about the shepherd and his sheep. At the end of the day, they would have to pass under the rod of the shepherd before they would go in their safe little pen. And it was for personal and intimate examination by the faithful shepherd. And why did he have to do this? Well, sheep were stupid and fearful. And they used to fall in briars and they couldn't get up because they were so top heavy. And they wouldn't lay down and rest unless they were near quiet water. And so they were fearful, and they were often found with parasites and briars and spurs and cuts. And so they would go under the rod and he would check each one, and he'd put salve on their wounds, and he'd pick the stickers out of them, and he put ointment on them to relieve the parasites that irritate them and cause them to never be at rest. And this is a beautiful picture of our Savior, the Good Shepherd, who does the same thing for us. When they come before his presence, he gives us that beautiful healing salve so that we can lay down in rest before him. So how prophetic. All their ears were to hear these words in the Torah in the 7th year of the Shemitah. Now, God does the choosing who is going to be released, and he chose that group of people, and when they would hear that read to all the nation, the 7th year, and where? Ultimately, Jerusalem. Now then, it was back in the tabernacle, but one day it would be in the permanent temple. And so it said, so all will hear, Shema, learn, lamad, that's where we get talmudim, or disciple in Hebrew, those who learn, fear, have awe and reverence, and actually walk out and do. And then keep his word, his commands. Keep is the same word for shamar, to guard. So protect it, keep it pure. Don't change it. Don't add things to it. Don't take away from it, from its truth and its meaning. That's the beautiful meaning of truth. What was, is, and always will be. That's what truth is. It doesn't change with the time. God's truth never changes. And cultures do, traditions do, but not truth. Notice that Moses didn't mention Jerusalem anywhere. Well, at that time, there was only the city of Salem, and that's where Melchizedek, King Melchizedek, lived. Now, this was ultimately Yeshua's priestly spiritual line because he was called the King of Righteousness. And that's where he would begin his ministry, in the same city of Jerusalem. You see, this is Yara, to cast forth, and to cause awe, and it's part of this word, Salem, Yerushalayim. Okay, so Zechariah 6 also speaks of a shoot that will come out of the same place, the city of Jerusalem. Now, the rabbis all agree that this chapter 6 of Zechariah is the most messianic of all the Tanakh. They're waiting for this shoot that will come and bring peace and order and reestablish God's kingdom in Jerusalem. This is what they're waiting for. Now, at that time in Israel, the place God chose was originally the Mishkan, and that was the tabernacle. So eventually, it was going to be where the temple stood. So Moses' gathering of Israel reminds us of the final gathering of God's people in the last feast called the Feast of Booths, or Sukkot. That's coming up too soon. Now, it's the end of the agricultural cycle and a time to begin to plant for the next harvest. It would be planting for the next group of fruitfulness or time of fruitfulness. But in order for that to happen, there had to be the rains. So this was a time where they would pray for rain. Now, pray for rain in our culture today, for God's truth to come and to bring healing and soothing, living water to people who are lost and everything's out of order. Let your word fall like rain, like water from the mountains, from the heaven. And so at the Feast of Booths, they would feast under a sukkah, because a sukkah is only a temporary place where they would feast. But one day will be taken to the permanent tabernacle. And that's the only feast that will be celebrated in the new kingdom that God will establish on earth. Did you know that? They're going to keep the feast of Sukkot. Why? Because it'll be the ultimate tabernacle with mankind in God's kingdom. That's so beautiful. That presence will be permanent from then on. So let's review, if we would, Moses' personal testimony. It would start something like this. I began as a little baby, and they wanted to kill me and get rid of me. My grandfather was Levi. My father was Amram, and my mother, Jochebed, meaning glory, God's glory. Are we surprised? Then I became a man. I lived in the house of Pharaoh, and God used me as a prophet to redeem the whole nation of Israel, to intercede and pray and lead them out. He would be a poet who would write not only the Torah down, but he wrote Psalm 90. Did you know that? And he was a songwriter. And so God told me, the day of your death is drawing nigh. This is what God told the people. The day of my death is drawing nigh. Now, did you know that the fast of Yom Kippur calls upon Jews everywhere to ask this question during the day on Yom Kippur? Will we live through this season and go on with a new lease on life, or is it our appointed time to die? That's the question they ask. Of course, they're thinking both spiritual and physical, but how about if we asked ourselves the same thing? Will I be around for another season to see the next generation of fruitfulness in my family, in my culture? Or is it my appointed time to die? I always joke and say, we have a little expiration date stamped on our forehead, and we won't die one day sooner or later than that date. So there is no reason to live in fear. And that's why I choose to know that as soon as he's done with me, he'll take me. It'll be my appointed time. So Moses and Joshua were to present themselves before the Mishkan, and God appeared in a pillar of cloud right over the Mishkan. And Moses kept on writing, was faithful to finish the Torah. And when it was done, God said to him, take that Torah and put it next to the Ark of the Covenant, okay? That agreement, that place of intimacy with God and man, as a witness against you. You're like, what? Because God knew that they wouldn't remain faithful. And he wanted God's word, the Torah, to be right there next to the original tablets that were in the ark, along with Moses' staff, the symbol of authority, and then the broken tablets, meaning they symbolic of breaking promises. So he said, go put the Torah right next to all that, because in the future, they're going to be unfaithful to me. And I want them both there side by side. It's almost like you could see the living Torah seated at the right hand of the Father in heaven as a witness to those who will be faithful and those who will not. We talked about that last week, the goats and the sheep, the wheat and the tares. And so now we have the Torah along with the altar and everything, the Ark of the Covenant and everything it holds. So you can see the parallels here, can't you? So then Adonai spoke to Moses and said, when I bring them out of the land, into the land, flowing with milk and honey, then they'll turn away and disaster will come upon them. Then my anger, which is justified, will flare up against them, and I will abandon them and hide my face from them. And we know their history. He scattered them. He scattered them when the Assyrians took the northern tribes away, and the southern two tribes were taken off to Babylon. Then they were scattered by the Romans, and then later on throughout the world, scattered. But as we said last week, God is going to bring them back. He's not done with Israel. So God tells Moses, they will provoke me and offer themselves as prostitutes to other gods and break that covenant. Look at the word prostitute. It's the word zina. Zina, it means unfaithful and defective. So they're going to defect from the true God and go after false gods, gods that can't speak, hear, do a thing for them. They're going to be deceived into thinking somebody other than God can meet all their needs and satisfy them. And it says, and you will do evil. And the word evil is ra'ah, means brokenness. So it's almost like these clay pots here, broken. They would call these ra'ah. They can no longer function in their design and purpose, which was what? To hold water. And that's a picture of us spiritually. We're meant to hold the living water from the mountain that waters the land of our hearts and brings forth a crop, brings forth a harvest. And so he said, that was my original plan, but they're going to prostitute themselves and be defective and broken. Disaster will come upon you in the last days, the Akarit Yamim. Now gather all the leaders so I can say the same thing to Haman. And he says, I call heaven and earth as the two witnesses against them. For I know that even now, while I'm still alive, they are unfaithful. How much more after my death? And boy, you can see this in families where they have, godly parents, and, the children go along with everything as long as mom and dad are alive. But as soon as the godly ones die off, we default, and the next generation forgets who they are, forgets what it cost the parents to bring them to that place, and many times fall away. So how much more, he says, after my death? So Moses says, I'm going to write a song. Now, God told him to write the song, but he's going to write a song, and it starts like this. And next time we're going to go over the song in more detail, but it says, listen, you heavens. In other words, listen, God above. Hear, O earth, people, the words of my mouth. May my teaching, my words, flow like rain. Where does it come from? Heaven. Teaching is the word lakach, means to take or receive or to marry something. You know, like in cooking, if you're going to marry a sauce with something else, they call it marrying when you mix the two together and they become intimate and change the condition of both of them. Well, it says, let my teaching, the rain, fall and have relationship with the soil and then bring forth fruit. So to marry, let God's spirit marry ours through circumcision of the heart. May my speech condense like dew. So he's comparing this rain to words. My words like light rain on blades of grass or showers on growing things. Plants respond to the rain, don't they? They grow and they produce fruit. And that's what God wants from us. He wants us to respond to his words, to respond to his spirit that says, come, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest for your souls. It's like the rain then penetrates the soil, which houses the farmer's seed. Look at these two beautiful scriptures and all. I'm about to end in Jeremiah 3. Therefore, the showers, meaning the ones they're looking for the next crop, because of their unfaithfulness, he says, therefore the showers have been what? Withheld, and no spring rains have flowed down. Yet you have that brazen look of a prostitute, and you refuse to blush. In other words, you have no conviction of wrongdoing anymore. You just thumb your nose in God's face. And then look at Jeremiah 14. Do any of the worthless idols of the nations bring rain? He's saying, why are you going to them? They don't bring the rain down. You know, they're the ones that cause this famine, because you're going to the gods that can't speak. They're dead. So it says, do the skies themselves send down showers? No, it is you, Adonai, Lord, our God. Therefore, where do we put our hope? In those false gods? No. Therefore, our hope is in you, the God of heaven. And I love it that this swan song was really more like a love song of a bride and groom. And we're going to cover that next week. But he wanted to give them this lasting song so they would memorize it and sing it for all generations. And it was to encourage them to what? Return and be healed. Now we're going to cover it next week, but I love this return. In Hebrew, to return is to repent. It's the word teshuvah. It means to return and dwell with. So in other words, he's calling his lost kids home. Come back and dwell with me. Come back. I'm here waiting. That's the story of the prodigal son. And I love this art form called kintsugi. And it's where they take broken vessels and they heal them and put them back together with gold. And God continues that same process with us, where he takes our brokenness and he fills in all those places with the very presence, the gold glory of who he is. And we're even stronger and more beautiful when he takes our brokenness and he makes us whole again. So that's the message of returning. Now in Rosh Hashanah, it ends on the last day with this prophetic element that they do in their traditions. And at the end of the synagogue service, they do what is called tashlich. Tashlich comes from the word shalach, to send out. And what it means is that when King Messiah comes, it says he will hurl or send out all your iniquities into the sea. And so they go down to water that's moving. It's called living water, and they cast their bread on the water. And it's a symbol of casting their sin upon the water. Now, what's interesting is that bronze basin that we see in the temple in ancient Israel, the first and second temple, that bronze basin of water where the priests would cleanse themselves before they went into for service to God, they called it the sea. They called it the sea because it was the place of cleansing. So by throwing these sins on the sea, it was symbolic of their being cleansed from the inside out. And they do it. You'll see these people down in La Jolla Shores or somewhere down at Moonlight, the last day of Rosh Hashanah, throwing bread into the sea. And it comes from Micah 7:19, where they will cast the bread upon the waters. Now, it says in Habakkuk 2 that this revelation or this truth awaits an appointed time. And it speaks of the end. Though it tarry, it says, yet wait for it. And it's speaking of a person, Messiah. This is a prophetic time where the Messiah would come and take away and cleanse all sin from mankind. And it says it is coming. And the prophets all predicted it when Jesus would come, God's servant, and die. And this is Messiah ben Joseph. But the second time he comes, he's coming as king, Messiah ben David. And he will bring justice on the earth. And he will judge the righteous and the unrighteous. So keep watch, because you don't know when that day could be. So Matthew 4, I'll end with this: repent. Come back to your Father, for the kingdom of God is at hand, meaning it's close. And the king is coming. Will you crown him as your king? Will you give him reign over the kingdom of your life? That's a good place to stop, isn't it? So I pray that during this time of reflection and repentance, that you will take a scan of your own life and say, gosh, I've tried everything, I've done everything, and I still feel this void. There's an emptiness. This emptiness was spoken about in the very first day of creation. And what was brought forth first? Light, revelation. And so God speaks of that earth being formless and void. And we sense a void when that place that's empty in us, it's a void that can only be filled with God's Holy Spirit. And once we receive that free gift of salvation, God fills us back with his Holy Spirit and gives us that power that we need to live our life for him as his servants. And so, Lord, I pray that for those listening today, that this would be a day of contemplation and a day of completion as they call on your name and ask you to forgive them, ask you to come into their life and make them clean and pure before you. In Jesus' name, amen. Shabbat shalom, and I'll see you next time on Sparky's Torah Time.